Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and returning to the show is Dr. Chris Knight, British anthropologist and activist whose work is overlapping extensively on the history of Chomsky. Your book, Decoding Chomsky, came out a while back now. I'm actually trying to remember when it came out, but I feel like I've had it on my shelf for
2016, and the paperback 2 years later.
Yeah. Okay. I also will be referring to an appearance you made on Navarra Media in February, as well as an article you wrote for Counterpunch, in a series of articles going back to, I guess, Greg Grandin's kind of splitting of the baby towards Chomsky and in The Nation in December, and as well as maybe referring to Chris Hedges' critique in February as well. I'm going to I'm going to preface this with, we've known about Chomsky's relationship to Epstein for a couple of years, but the extent of which he was in the selection of the material that was released by the Department of Justice in America was surprising. And that include pictures of him chumming around with Steve Bannon and maybe potentially fitting into a documentary defending Epstein. What I do want to be clear on is, as of yet, and I don't see any way for us to know any more than what we already have, but as of yet, he has not been implicated in anything involving the island of any of that. But I was gonna ask you, because I was fairly convinced by your article in Counterpunch, and you've been working on Chomsky now for over a decade. What do you make of the extent in which he seemed to be a defender of Epstein significantly later than a lot of even other people who have mild implications of Chomsky's, it's not so mild, in the files?
Well, I think I'm as shocked as anybody else. It's hard to know what to make of it. And I certainly don't claim that my research that went into the book on Chomsky explains it. What I have been saying is that for Chomsky, finding positives in somebody who is or has been considered by Noam himself as a criminal, he's been doing that all his life, because he's been working with war criminals at MIT, people working on chemical warfare and nuclear missile design and so on. When he was working in the electronics research laboratory of electronics on what he called linguistics, which I don't really think was linguistics at all. It was more like command and control of electronically, organized weapon systems. When he was doing that, it was normal for him to be working with people that he regarded as criminals, and then finding all sorts of lovely things about them. So getting close to somebody who is kind of well known, even in his own eyes, as a criminal, was second nature to Chomsky. But that doesn't explain this particular case, which has its own explanations, I'm sure, and we can discuss them. I know a little bit about it, but it's not my area of research interest. I'm much more interested in the thing called the cognitive revolution and Noam's role in all that, and the way in which he transformed so many very significantly, critical disciplines, sociology and psychology and anthropology and archaeology. All those disciplines connected with what it means to be human were radically transformed by Noam. And that's my main interest, what was behind all that, and in what way were these, fields of thought transformed. But yes, I mean, it is absolutely shocking and surprising. I suppose particularly surprising because it turns out that the volume of emails between Noam and Valeria and Epstein was actually orders of magnitude more than has been found connecting Trump or various other people, at Prince Andrew, for example, and Epstein. There was just a vast amount of involvement, mutual involvement and interchange, and they're almost love letters. I mean, Valeria's letters to Epstein were about her love, and Noam's, and Noam backed that up. So it is really very, very shocking.
Yeah, it shocked me. I mean, there are academics around elite institutions like Steven Pinker who we'd known about, who I was frankly surprised how little were implicated in at least the batch of information that we have compared to Chomsky. What I know, we've known about meetings that he had with him as far back as 2023. That was somewhat made public. It also puts Chomsky as meeting with Epstein in some fairly questionable and elite groups like dinners with Woody Allen and Ehud Barak. His now somewhat infamous willingness to pile on what seemed Bannon, as I mentioned earlier, and maybe even appear in a documentary trying to defend Epstein. His email, I think the one that struck a lot of people is the emails in 2019 suggesting that Epstein had been mistreated by the U.S. press and that the best path ahead was to ignore the hysteria around it. On one hand, I'm with you. We do have evidence that Chomsky was, historically somewhat trusting of elite institutions and elite figures, even when he, knew or thought they were war criminals. But the level, the most charitable reading I can give, and I'm going to offer it first, is the level of naivete involved in this is to put it mildly, concerning in itself. And I know a lot of people on certain left commentariats have said, oh, this confirmed their view of Chomsky, blah 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 blah. But even me as a Chomsky critic, and I've been a critic of Chomsky for a long time, I was floored. So I guess to get a little bit along past the flooring, what do we know about the financial advice? I mean, he got from Epstein, and what do we know about? Let's make it in a more general sense. Chomsky's relationship to elite circles in general prior to this revelation.
I mean, Chomsky, of course, was close friends with John Deutsch, who became the director of the CIA. He was, I got close friends with all sorts of military advisors of the Kennedys and later on. So, I mean, he was used to, moving around in very, very, very elite circles. And of course, it was because he was an insider within the sort of Pentagon circle in many ways that he was so effective as a critic of, the Pentagon and the US military. He was an insider. He knew what was going on. He chatted with these people he regarded as criminals every other day, every other week. And so that already explains a lot. as for financial advice from Epstein, well, I mean, we know, don't we, that it was in 2018 that Chomsky's son, Harry, got very upset with the way in which Chomsky was disinheriting, in many ways, him and Chomsky's two other children, his daughters, by cutting them out from any future royalties from Chomsky's political books. And Harry took Noam to court, as I understand it. Some of this may not be wholly accurate because it's a bit difficult to find out exactly what was going on. But there's no question that Noam needed legal advice and legal support. Now, when you say that, you say, poor man, he was in a bit of trouble with his son and needed some legal advice. I really don't see why that had to be a sex criminal like Jeffrey Epstein. You could get legal advice from all sorts of places. But of course, looking at it from the other side, you can see why Jeffrey Epstein was very anxious to improve his image, shall we say, by having around him all sorts of famous people, well-respected people, people not known for, wanting sex with underage girls, and you couldn't find somebody more useful to Epstein than this extraordinarily respectable figure, Noam Chomsky. And if you could, and once Epstein had brought him into his circle, he could then, of course, present himself as a figure of some respectability, and bring others. And so, getting hold of Chomsky as the first sort of captive, almost, by offering him all sorts of things. I mean, all sorts of lovely benefits. And in terms of travel and holidays and meals out, but of course advice. And so I think we have to say that in some ways Noam was a victim, but to sort of talk about it, to sort of excuse it by talking about his naivety. I mean, how on earth can anyone think of Noam Chomsky as naive when it comes to establishment figures of power? I mean, he was the one who, more than anyone else, said we always have to look behind the scenes to find out what's really going on. Don't believe what people say. Look at what they do some proper investigation. I mean, he was brilliant at looking behind the appearances to what was going on underneath. So why on earth did he suddenly lose that when it came to this terrible, horrible criminal? It's hard to know how to relate to it all. It really is very, very hard. But what we do know is that his new wife, Valeria, was very anxious on his behalf, that he was very anxious to make sure that Noam was able to go ahead with this transfer of royalties to her and him at the expense of Chomsky's 3 children by Carol, his wife, who died in 2008. And I don't know, obviously we've got to be quite careful. I mean, it's sort of blaming the wife isn't too sensible either. That's all too easily done. And of course, it's hard to know how to approach any of this now that Chomsky's out of action, or having suffered this terrible stroke a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. But Derek, I mean, what do we do?
It's hard to know. I mean, one of the things that confounds me about it is that Chomsky enters the playing field with Epstein so much later than a lot of other figures that are similar to him. I mean, like, I people who really follow the Epstein files and its implications for Ivy League intellectuals with public footprints may know about Epstein's relationships to John Brockman and the Edge Group, which were a bunch of public-facing scientists who were supposed to bridge the two culture gap Brockman was a literary agent, worked with people like Steven Pinker. There's kind of an infamous release of, I think there were 68 photos that were at an Edge Group's dinner with Epstein there. And it implicated all kinds of people, including your normal tech moguls like Bezos, Musk, Sergey Brin, but also a lot of Harvard and MIT academics. And Chomsky wasn't part of that, but these moves to get into academic circles as a way to get some kind of respectability and a kind of, I don't know, mission for all the various it's financial crimes, in addition to all the sexual crimes and everything else. I mean, the number of financial crimes that we discovered in this batch of information is kind of staggering. And these are not just from random FBI interviews that are unfollowed up. They're in the emails and email logs. And what I find interesting about that is that, however, whatever you say about it, and a lot of these people are pretty deeply implicated in the files, that's relatively that's after they should have known better, but relatively early on. But by like 2017, 2018, 2019, you have to kind of know. Like if you're in those circles, like this was not hidden at this point. I am I guess that element of it is one of the most baffling is how late the Chomsky seem to have been pulled into the circle, but also how thoroughly. And I guess you're right on we can't, like, the most positive and I don't even think it's that positive take on Chomsky's naivete really is hard for me to square with the access to these kinds of people that he already had. And that is kind of impressive. I guess one point that you have made, though, and in your article in Counterpunch, that maybe we can talk a little bit about, is Chomsky's ability to bifurcate his public personas, his research, his relation to MIT, his, like, where he thought the line was with working with MIT, but where, how he's going to avoid direct implications in military research, but had all kinds of indirect implications into military research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think this kind of, for lack of a better term, and I'll use the one you use, dualism, affected his ability to, how much did he basically, I'm trying to figure out the most charitable way to say this, but
well, he was in some, in very significant ways, two-timing all his adult life. I mean, he was extraordinarily clever in sort of, it's hard to quite explain how the left could have been so blind, but I mean, all the time he was criticizing the military, he was working for the military. I mean, how come the left just, it was in plain sight, but they somehow didn't see it. And because the voice he used, the way in which he spoke, the identity he assumed in opposing the military, the US military and the Pentagon, was so different and almost unrecognizable compared with the voice he used inside the research laboratory of electronics, and when he was having, say, lunch, with the future director of the CIA or any of these other people. I mean, he was so successful in being sort of two people and not letting one interfere with the other. That was a critical thing, that there was like a firewall between the anti-militarist Noam Chomsky and the actively working for the military Noam Chomsky. There was so little in common between them that somehow he managed to get away with it. And it's only since there's these recent scandalous developments that everything's completely imploded, because the whole world can now see the two Chomskys, see the contradictions between them, and somehow this extraordinary sort of conjuring act of being two people almost invisible to each other, never mind to the rest of the world, has completely collapsed. And somehow we can see almost the entire conjuring trick. And it's been obviously just so difficult for so many on the American left. I mean, over here in Britain, we've never been so much under the sway of Chomsky. We've been more likely to be Trotskyists and various versions of revolutionary communists, like myself. But in the States, of course, being a Chomskyan has been a really significant part of the very existence of the left, and it all depended on that kind of conjuring trick, that firewall concealing one Chomsky from his diametrical opposite. I mean, as I think I said in the last interview with you, that the thing for all of us to get is that working for the US military is just not the same thing as spending a whole life working as an activist against the US military. They're more than just different, they're diametric opposites, and it's hard to imagine how one can exist alongside the other. But in some ways, I've always felt that the two Chomskys kind of needed each other in the way, say, with a magnet, the North Pole sort of needs the South Pole. The two opposites kind of benefit from each other. And it's an astonishing trick that Chomsky managed to work. But I don't think it was just because he was clever. I think it was very largely because the US military industrial establishment actually sort of, in so many ways, benefited from having somebody who was able to, with all the best intentions, I'm sure, on his part, fulfill a very strange intermediary function in straddling the political divide in the US society.
Yeah, I think about, in some ways, this kind of dual nature and a kind of hyper focus on an awareness of what the U.S. role in the world was, and yet also a trust, or it's not the right word, but a belief that some of these elite circles were in some ways still valid, if for no other reason than skills seems to come through. And I think it led to, I mean, I don't just think unlike Epstein, it's led to political mistakes for a long time. Somewhat famously, Chomsky's stances on Cambodia were very bad. And I always initially chalked that up to diehard anti-Sovietism and just belief in the common critiques of the Soviet Union at the time. A lot of which came from Maoists who were in the Sino-Soviet split, aligned with Mao support of the Khmer Rouge. But the more now about the relationship of Kissinger to using the Vietnam Cambodian conflicts as a way to even further drive a wedge in the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, when you have Marxist Leninists killing each other, it's pretty good at driving a wedge. And I've now been asking, like, how much is that also because at some level he at least partially trusted stuff coming out of the U.S. State Department and military. I've wondered about this a lot, and I don't think I know we can't know. We don't know Chomsky's heart. We know, that's not something that I can figure out, and he's not conscious enough for us to ask him, and I don't know that his close associates would necessarily tell us either. But I was thinking about that when I was reading your writing on his relationship with Jerome Wesner. And I wanted you to talk about, the way in which Chomsky, despite, trying to nominally set up a firewall between his work and the U.S. military, how much Wesner probably used Chomsky's linguistics for his command and control systems and stuff like that. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think Jerome Wiesner was able to use it because, as far as I can work out, none of it worked. None of it worked at all. But I mean, there was this huge, massive sort of hope that this young Jewish, very, very clever intellectual might come up with something quite extraordinary. I mean, to sort of compare it with the Manhattan Project is going too far, but I mean, they certainly were hoping that in effect a weapon would come out of Chomsky's work, not exactly something which would explode, but this if Chomsky could come up with universal grammar, which would then enable extraordinarily powerful ways of exercising command and control over electronic weaponry. At that time, nuclear weaponry, it could give the U.S. military an astonishing military advantage in the world. And so there was always that hope. And Chomsky sort of played along with that hope, while at the same time being quite careful to stress that in no way was he going to roll up his sleeves and get out a screwdriver or any other sort of actual material equipment and start making such such devices. I mean, he what he always said was that he's happy, rather like Einstein with eventually having some connection with nuclear weaponry. Einstein would work on, if you like, theory, physics, and Chomsky made it clear that he would work on some of the theory that would be required to actually operationalize the work and actually make a weapon, but he wouldn't go any further than that. And so he could always calm his conscience. I'm not making weaponry. I'm doing deep theory about computational systems and relevant to all sorts of areas of the study of cognition. In all sorts of different fields. So I mean, I definitely don't think that. I mean, what's so interesting is that even when it became absolutely clear that none of Chomsky's theories would work, it didn't make any difference to his standing, any difference to his value to Jerome Wiesner and others, with such extraordinary standing, in terms of, organizing the US's nuclear weapons build-up. And then what we find, of course, is that Noam was reciprocating that support by, I mean, again, rather weirdly, trying to picture Wiesner as not exactly a pacifist, but as somebody on the side of controlling and reducing the insane multiplication of nuclear weapons in the States, echoed to some extent by what the Soviet Union was doing. So somehow Chomsky managed to put these people who were almost insane militarists, to put them into a different light and picture them as kind of doves as opposed to hawks, which just wasn't true of Wiesner. And of course we've got to remember that Wiesner was Chomsky's. I mean, in a big, academic institution, you don't exactly have workers and bosses. If anyone was Chomsky's boss, it was Wiesner, and who was responsible for the initial huge buildup of nuclear weaponry by Kennedy and then subsequent presidents. So the issue is, what was the Pentagon getting out of Noam if they weren't getting anything which would actually work technically? And I think they were well aware of Chomsky's appeal, political appeal to so many people on the left, particularly in the States, and they realized it would be quite useful from their point of view, I think, to keep him in that position, because someone's going to be sort of, in some sense, I don't think in charge of the left, but being a leading figure, helping to lead, the left in the States. There was always going to be some kind of left, and if Chomsky wasn't a major figure, an inspirational figure for the left, who would it be? It could be somebody that the Reason and others wouldn't know who they were, wouldn't be able to have meals with them, wouldn't be able to sort of cope with them. It would be much less controllable from their point of view, as having Chomsky kind of in charge. I'm saying in charge in a sort of obviously metaphorical sense. I'm not saying Chomsky was in charge of the left exactly, but he was probably the most persuasive and influential figure. Why not keep him there? Because then you've got somebody with a massive influence over the left that you, within the Pentagon, can relate to and meet up with and find out what they're thinking and have quite intimate conversations. Because there's no doubt that Chomsky was having intimate conversations with people that he regarded as war criminals, pretty much all his life.
This brings me to, I remember one of Chomsky's responses to you when he was more cognizant after your book first came out, which is that the Pentagon during the Cold War was just funneling taxpayer money for all kinds of basic science, and they didn't really care what the researchers actually did, which may, to some degree, from what I've read about the funding of this stuff in the Cold War. I particularly think about Louis Menand's book about the way Cold War largesse really drove a lot of strange things in academia. I can also think about Gabriel Rockhill's recent book, finding that like most academics had some relationship to either the State Department or the CIA, and I was like, "Duh! Do you know how academic funding works?" Clearly, you do actually, because you're an academic. But I mean, I do. But what I do find interesting about this is people will respond to that. We're like, "Well, this is guilt by association," and I don't think that's what you're doing. What I'm more interested in is, even if you don't believe that these intellectuals, and Chomsky is one, but you can think about Marcuse's relationship to both the OSS and the State Department. You can think about all kinds of people. And even if you don't think that their relationship to these governmental organizations was actually shaping their research, which is, I think, more of an open question than has currently been established. And I don't know how you'd prove some of it unless you found a smoking gun in a letter from, I don't know, some CIA official telling somebody to do something. And I don't think those things exist. I find it interesting to think about what the purpose of having, so many intellectual figures in these kinds of places would have been to the military and the intelligence establishment in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because it wasn't just Chomsky. I mean, like, you find it in weird places like Terence McKenna, Gloria Steinem. You can just go through and Marcuse, as I mentioned. What's interesting about Chomsky is you don't find him as directly implicated in quite as many, like, oh, I took a grant from the OSS. But I do think we need to think about what the federal government was doing with having so many, opposition to the American government kind of close to these military officials in academia during the Cold War and after. And you're right to me about Chomsky being so important. When I was a teenager, I mean, I think I was 13 or 14. And you went into a left-wing book, and a left-wing bookstore that wasn't an anarchist or Marxist bookstore led by somebody who was probably not to be vulgar, but your age. If you didn't go to one of those, the only thing that you were going to encounter that wasn't like a progressive Democrat writing a book that was probably about a campaign was all these little short books by Chomsky. I mean, particularly after 9/11, but like even in the 1990s, I would find these little books. They were just Chomsky interviews on American foreign policy. I think the time that I remember him focusing on was East Timor. And that would be your introduction to a kind of high level critique of American militarism. And it was something that was kind of strangely culturally ubiquitous because we would treat Chomsky as if he was a anti-establishment figure outside of those things. We'd go and buy these little books in like big corporate bookstores, and yet also, Chomsky was interviewed in zines. Chomsky's so-called open door policy meant that like all kinds of small publishers or whatever could have access to him if he had time to talk to you that week. And it meant he was everywhere. And I think it's interesting when you're like, well, who else would it have been? Now, the only other figure I can think about like that in that time period was Michael Parenti, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics of Parenti's politics, and I'm not going to do the Parenti versus Chomsky thing. But it is sort of interesting that those were the kinds of options on the table, because you had Parenti, who was defending the USSR, but also had actually some very strange opinions, and never even, I think, formally called himself like a Marxist-Leninist. I'm not even sure if he called himself a Marxist. I'd have to go back. So I find this kind of like idea that there was zero pressure, and by talking about the zero pressure, we're like somehow tarring Chomsky by association. I do think we have to ask ourselves, what was the military getting out of that? Like you said, like there was a reason they kept funding these people and doing something. Was it just like, it could have been as simple as, well, if we have these dissidents, then we can just talk to them and we got intelligence. I don't know.
Well, clearly, the CIA and the Pentagon, in the struggle against communism, as they called it, and the Soviet Union, weren't just interested in physical weaponry. I mean, clearly they were interested in undermining communism, as they called it, and obviously that included Marxism. And for me, I've never been very keen on Marxism as a kind of religion. To me, the project which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were attempting to get off the ground was the product of connecting up the different areas of science, including Darwinism, of course, but all sorts of other branches of science, preventing them from appearing to contradict each other and allowing them to come together into a more or less coherent image, and then following science as connected up, and to do that, of course, these days would be, when you think of climate science and all the other versions of science which we are so much in need of giving political primacy to, that would be absolutely revolutionary. And in my own view, whether consciously or not, probably not all that consciously, Chomsky's contribution was to cut science out of left-wing politics, to make sure that nobody turned to science, so that you could have all these criticisms of all sorts of different things going on, but no revolutionary, creative, optimistic, realistic alternative. And how did Chomsky do that? Well, he reversed, or got a very long way in reversing the whole materialist program that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were so keen on. In other words, the very idea of conditions determine consciousness, and the very idea that material changes are needed in order to give rise to changes in consciousness. There's no revolutionary consciousness, which is just sort of in the head. You have to be connected up. You have to feel powerful. The working class has to feel confident in itself and its ability to win allies, and become revolutionary, and becoming, if you like, aware of so many different branches of science, which makes sense. Well, Chomsky's contribution was to put mind over matter as opposed to matter over mind, and actually directly turn upside down, turn on its head that communist or Marxist project. And it all happened with this peculiar idea of a language module, a language organ inside the head. This module then became, in addition to something which gave rise to a purely internal, talking to yourself version of language, which is just, obviously it's just thought. It can't possibly be language if it never gets out of your head. So you had this language module, and then people like Steven Pinker and so many others. I could list a whole lot of names, and you'd be familiar with them, but what's the point exactly? But you had a face recognition module, a cheat detection module, all these different modules, and that gave rise to this wretched kind of doctrine called evolutionary psychology. And I'm now talking about the US version of evolutionary psychology. So the head is full of all these different computer modules. They hardly even talk to each other. They each do their own sort of job. And when something happens that changes politics, it's because one or other of these modules has got active. And so you have this, and this was called the cognitive revolution in the human sciences. So psychology, archaeology, human archaeology, and primatology, and we're all supposed to be influenced by this thing called the cognitive revolution. And the cognitive revolution was, I mean, it's obviously a pretty complicated thing, completely right-wing in its actually, in terms of most of its recruits and advocates, and as well as in its policies, was the idea that different modules get switched off and on, and as a result of that, you get changes in social relationships and all that. And history is sort of the story of the changes introduced as modules get switched off and on. It's a completely mind over matter concept, and the exact reverse of Marxism. And it's been very influential, particularly in the States. I mean, cognitive archaeology, cognitive anthropology, anything called cognitive. You as soon as you see that word, you know that it's not materialist. Unfortunately, of course, as I say in the book on Chomsky, my book, there's a huge benefit in a lot of that stuff, post-war stuff, because at least it meant that scientists were aware there is such a thing as mind. It's a huge advance on the wretched behaviorist nonsense that that there's no such thing as mind. That humans haven't got. We respond to rewards and punishments as we learn things, rather like rats in a maze or mice in a maze. So there's all sorts of, in some ways, positive outcomes of all that. But overwhelmingly, it was reflected the fact, the reason the CIA and the American establishments supported all that, and it did come originally from Noam Chomsky. The first module to be respected and regarded as real was this language module. It was anti-communist in its essence, and of course, to somehow remove science from politics was no small achievement. And every time Noam was asked by some radical, "Oh, Noam, I so want to know more about your linguistics. How is it going to help the cause, the anarchist cause, the socialist cause, the revolutionary cause?" He'd always say, No, don't go there. It's sort of, you more or less tell them it's none of your business, and it wasn't their business. It was the whole of his linguistics was, if you like, the business of as I say, these Pentagon-funded scientists attempting to increase the control over their weaponry. And just for one more thing, mind over matter means religion, and in I think it was 2014. When Chomsky gave a talk to the Vatican, he was applauded for his theory of the origin of language because it was creationism. That, it said that language suddenly emerged without any evolution, nothing to do with Darwin. It just popped up suddenly in perfect form in an instant. The assembled theologians and cardinals were thrilled, and that was a very important part of Chomsky's sort of objective role. I'm not saying he was set out to be a sort of religious leader, but in my own view, his version of cognitivism was kind of religion. I call it scientism as opposed to science. Scientism with a big capital S. And this language module effectively is the soul. It's the thing which makes us human, not the body. Bodies aren't intelligent. There's no such concept as body. Chomsky would often say. So you have mind over body. That goes with patriarchy, of course, because men have mind and women have bodies. And you can go on forever about all the implications of this absolute gibberish. What I'm sort of wanting to get across is the way in which Noam Chomsky didn't want any science at all to have political meaning, to have political relevance. He wanted to just, in the end, you had this complete disjunction, just, like a firewall between his politics and his science, in other words, between the two versions of himself. And insofar as that became sort of apparently authoritative on the left, it just meant you could be active without being scientifically aware. And whereas for me, and I think, if Marx and Engels were still alive, and obviously there are plenty of Marxists around, but not very influential these days, the critical thing is that science needs to be given a voice. Science needs to be all the different branches of science, which are now so critical to our survival as a species on this planet. Climate scientists, first and foremost, but they all link up with each other. They need to be given a voice because our future depends on that. I mean, if science doesn't govern politics, politics governs, everything, and we end up with Donald Trump, who doesn't believe in science at all. But and of course, it's not just Donald Trump; it's so many other people that no longer believe even that we're destroying the climate every time we drive a car, a petrol guzzling car. So, I mean, to me, if there is to be a future, somehow we've got to empower the sciences, help them connect together, help them to drive a voice. Clearly, that voice would have to be a political voice, but it would mean science governing politics, as opposed to the terrible alternative, which is politics governing science, which is increasingly what we've got now. Politicians just making things up, like Donald Trump does. But it's not just Donald Trump. All over the place, people just starting to make things up.
Yeah, I find this, maybe this is where I can drop the argument about this whole like counter materialism project as a coherent project, and really focus in on something that I've always found strange about Chomsky, and you've talked a lot about, and we can maybe tie this into what happened with Epstein and all that. But is that Chomsky would insist there was a human nature, right? He would insist it. He would talk about it a lot in his political writings, but he would also insist that we could learn nothing about human nature from his linguistics, which, until I read your book, actually completely baffled me. Because I'm like, but you're using linguistics to define what is human. You're saying it's innate in our brains, and yet you're also saying it's completely unrelated to our political nature. And I know you're fighting Foucauldians and behaviorists or whatever, but where then does our human nature come from for you, and how would we understand it? And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about Chris Hedges' article that he wrote around the same time as the one you wrote for Counterpunch, where he said that Chomsky had a clinical hyper-rationalist worldview that led to a failure of moral imagination. And I was like, I don't think that's right, Hedges. I actually think what's more interesting is this way in which he'd make assertions about essential things about humanity, cooperation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but then somehow would remove it from discussions of any science for which as a means of knowing what that was. And I find that interesting, and I guess what I want to what your work has led me to believe is maybe in trying to separate those two things, descriptive claims about the world and some kind of set of universal moral norms or whatever, it actually does have ethical implications for how you conduct yourself if you split it in half like that.
Well, my view was and remains, although it's hard to be optimistic these days, obviously while there's life, there's hope, but my view is that if we are to bring together the sciences, and that means overcoming fundamentally the chasm between the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on, and the social sciences, we need to go back in history and prehistory to the point where there were not that split, that dichotomy between natural and social science hadn't yet formed. And one of the reasons I think that Noam Chomsky is so hostile to the very idea that language had an origin, an evolutionary origin, the way in which he just makes a nonsense of the whole idea that there's such a discipline as the study of how language itself evolved in our species. The way in which he makes a sort of joke of it with this ridiculous story about a cosmic ray shower and a macromutation, which, without any precursor or warning or reason, suddenly, implants a perfectly functioning language organ in a single individual's brain, where from this individual starts talking to itself. I mean, that is such a complete nonsense, nowhere near what 95% of people who've ever thought about the origin of language think. And my own view is that actually to try to work out how language in our species did emerge, it does take you to some amazing places, and very much about forms of kinship which connect people together, forms of solidarity, agency of females in addition to males, primary agency of females in many respects, because of course females would have been the core of communities, with all the strength of their different relationships, and hunter-gatherer camps. The buzzing, powerful core of the whole place is where the children are and the parents are, and the men tend to be a little bit more peripheral because they're mostly out hunting at a distance. I mean, I don't want to go into all that in any detail now, but the origin of language was revolutionary. It was a revolution. It produced a species which was kind of radically different from all of the rest of nature. We're clearly part of nature, but obviously quite clearly with the peculiar symbolic capacities and that we have, and language above all. We're a revolutionary species, and if there is to be a revolution which somehow recovers all that and reestablishes some of what it means to be human, we would need a revolution not too different from that early human revolution, as I call it. So I'm just saying, that putting science first would mean allowing the sciences to speak to each other, to connect up with each other, and that would be revolutionary. And the voice of those science. I mean, to me, it's so wretched that we have marvelously devoted climate scientists all drilling in the Arctic, the Antarctic, finding out all sorts of different things about different stages of the evolution of life on Earth, right back to when a huge nearby planet collided with us and turned into the moon. I mean, there's so many amazing things happened. It's a wonderful story. It can be put together now with all the resources that we have, and it certainly needs to be put together. And somehow, Chomsky's dishing of science is his idea that science does. He has this idea that science is tiny little bits of information, tiny little steps of a sort of advance of knowledge which you can't really connect up. I mean, that's the opposite of what we need today by way of a vision which has, might have some purchase given the what's actually happening as we speak. By the way, I mean what's happening in Lebanon and Gaza and Iran, and I mean the absolute cataclysmic disasters of a world run by idiots. I mean, just ignorant buffoons and idiots, criminals, more or less criminally insane, figures. I mean, I won't go into it right now, but I mean, what's going on now is what happens when we lose our bearings, when we lose all sense of proportion, when we lose all concepts of what morality and civilization and so on can involve. And I'm certainly not blaming Chomsky for all that, by the way. I mean, and actually, I would say the reverse. I mean, we do actually miss Noam in so many ways. I mean, he was as I've said so often, he was a voice of reason in an increasingly deranged world. It's just that the limitations of Noam Chomsky were also far more damaging than most people on the left seem to have realized. We wanted to go way beyond Chomsky several decades ago to get to a better place than the one we're at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty strong point when I think about it. When I look at Chomsky, I also don't want to say like everything Chomsky wrote is not condemned by his relationship to Epstein any more than it was condemned by his working at MIT. There's still books that he wrote that on U.S. foreign policy in particular that really moved me. Yeah. I did find a couple of things about him frustrating because for all his syndicalism as a kind of moral norm, he was often a defensive institutionalist simultaneously, in that we have to defend the Democrats against this onslaught of, even though they're terrible, that the opposition is worse. And that for years, that was my main complaint about him. It's just like, well, but this is a system which, as long as you're bought into one of these sides, you're a captive player, and there's not much you can do about these elites. And the other thing I think that you point out is that it does lead to this weird, like, political norms come out of just moral convention. Although for Chomsky, somehow that moral convention was like almost a Kantian universal. It does seem to me that there is some continuity between the kind of bifurcation that Chomsky was willing to do between science and human nature, between science and politics, that also involves this bifurcation of him in elite circles versus him talking to like anybody. I mean, the thing about Chomsky is he really would talk to, like, I had people, I know people who just email him and he'd do an interview to nobody. I mean, he was incredibly generous with stuff like that. It was always hard for me to square. I think for me, the Epstein revelations has just got me really thinking about the way participation in these institutions, if you're not very, very aware and careful, can implicate you in far larger things. And bifurcating it or trying to separate things out doesn't really get you out of the problem.
One of the strange, sad things seems to have been that Chomsky was so much doing what you've been describing, so much responding to emails, staying up late. Every last email had to be responded to, no matter who it came from, that he wasn't really living much of a life. I mean, he actually has been saying that recently. He's always been very lonely, without much social life. I think his children must have been a bit fed up with him. When's Dad got around for us? I mean, he wasn't. And I think what seems to have happened, really ironically and sadly, is that it was when with Valeria he became befriended by Jeffrey Epstein that suddenly he realized that you could have fun, you could go out, you could have meals, you could go, I don't know, all sorts of things which most humans take for granted as part of being alive, suddenly became given to him, or not exactly given to him, but I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, I mean, evidently allowed Chomsky to, with his new wife, go places, do things, enjoy, aspects of life which most of us think, well, that is part of being a person, actually alive, in ways which he hadn't done before. And it's just so ironic and sad that it had to be with Jeffrey Epstein, a guy who was, made money out of, abusing underage girls as a living, and then obviously wanting to sort of, I think, with Epstein, sort of almost like run the world by having so many top people sort of, under his spell, partly blackmail, I think, because if these people have had underage sex and the only person who knows about it is Epstein, he can get them to do stuff. And it's just so tragic that of all people, Noam Chomsky should have sort of discovered life, real social life, real enjoyment with a young woman, his new wife, under the auspices of that sex criminal. I mean, I don't know. It's just it's kind of worse, better and worse than Shakespearean tragedy. It's kind of laughable in some ways. You can sort of laugh. Sometimes it's hard not to. It's so ridiculous, all of it. And yet, of course, it genuinely has been an absolute tragedy, not only for Chomsky himself, but for his family and all those who expected so much more of him. A real tragedy. And he's now, I know there are still people who try to make allowances, and I don't know, just say poor Chomsky was taken for a ride. He was too trusting. He was too good a person, even, no, not really. I mean, it was, it shows you, I'll tell you what it shows. It shows that intellectuals are corruptible, that Noam Chomsky himself, while he could have stuck to his principles about the Vietnam War, he could have left MIT, said, I'm not doing all this stuff. I'm not helping the Pentagon to make, weapons to kill peasants in another country far away. Obviously, had he done that, he wouldn't have been so influential. He would have been like most of the rest of us. He could have got a voice, but who's listening to that voice? And in a sense, by staying at MIT, he chose a sort of level of corruption. I mean, a level of getting the income, the good life that you can have by doing something which he knew was immoral. I no question he must have known it was absolutely immoral, because he keeps on denying that he was doing any military work. It's absolutely ridiculous. Of course he was doing military work in the sense he was working for the military in an electronics lab who expected him to come up with some useful stuff, which would be operationalized in this building of the MITRE Corporation, where they actually turned theory into practice. There's no question that the military wanted some usable hardware at some point in the future. But Chomsky was, despite everything, he was kind of willing to be corrupted, but never corrupted so much as he was by Jeffrey Epstein, when he and Valeria decided to get on his plane, go places, do all this fun stuff, which he'd not been able to do before. So yes, I mean, it is very, very, very sad that Noam turned out to be every bit as corruptible as all the other various intellectuals that he warned us against, by the way, of course, in that early New York Review of Books article, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, when he was urging people who are intellectuals, who've got all these privileges, to take their responsibility very, very, very seriously. And he himself, at the end of the day, failed on that count, failed by his own standards calamitously. And even in many ways, even worse in the connection with Epstein, because it just turned out that when he was actually talking to Epstein, he had almost a contempt for women who stand up for themselves. When he talked about the Me Too movement and described those women sort of complaining, it's obviously a rather mild word, about being raped by their boss, he accused them of hysteria. But he only accused them of hysteria in a private message to, of all people, Jeffrey Epstein. And so very, very, very sad. And there's so many people on the left in the States, I've been reading a few of their emails, they're just saying it leaves people feeling that, well, at the end of the day, you can't trust anybody. and that is really, really a tragic outcome.
Yeah, I would say we're definitely, the left in the United States is definitely struggling with some severe paranoia right now. Some of it justified. But I think, thinking about what we talked about today, one of the things that I really think about a lot is the dangers of compartmentalization, both in, like, socially, intellectually, but even between the spheres of knowledge, like science, activism, theory. These things all have to be in strong dialogue with each other, with some kind of, a commitment to a truth relationship, et cetera, that you integrate. And also, if you're constantly serving the people but not participating with them, you don't actually have skin in the game, and you probably don't actually empathize with them enough. You can't really stand apart. And if you stand apart, I do think, it's one thing I do agree with Hedges about. He calls it the trap of the great man, but you can really be easily manipulated because your actual social and embodied and integrated self is so removed from, for lack of a better term, the struggle. And I if that's the tragedy I see in what happened with Chomsky, that's a pretty big lesson. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll give you the last question would be just, what is your responses to that?
Well, I mean, you put it very well. You clearly know as much, if not quite a bit more, about these aspects of Chomsky and intellectual life and political life in the States than I do. Yes, it's very, very sad. How do we respond? Again, very, very difficult. I'm almost lost for words with all this. I wrote a book which I think is a very good one, Decoding Chomsky. I'm very proud of it. By the way, I should perhaps say that the hits on Wikipedia and various other sites on my book have gone up from about 3 a day to about 7,000 a day. Extraordinary. It's as if the book I wrote is the only one which measures up in any way to the cataclysmic events that have happened to destroy Chomsky's reputation. Something has to be salvaged from it all. And as you've said, and I would echo that, I mean, his political writings are still very, very, very much worth reading, but as information, not as inspiration. There's no program, no project, no future, nothing coming out of those books except very legitimate, very powerful, very moving condemnation. Noam Chomsky has been all his life, in so many ways, the moral conscience of the United States, insofar as America has had such a conscience. He's gone, and we're looking at what happens to a whole country, America, when there's absolutely no sign of any intelligence, conscience, morality, or anywhere near the summits, anywhere near the sources of state power. Quite an unusual situation for a country to be in, and of course, extremely threatening to our whole planet.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. Hopefully, if we speak again on the show, it will be about the more hopeful elements of anthropology and not another, to put it mildly, disaster. And the myriad of disasters of the last few decades. Thank you, Dr. Knight.
Okay, Derek. Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.